Então, boa tarde, good afternoon, welcome all. My name is João Biel. I'm professor and chair of anthropology and also director of the Brazil Lab at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, which is hosting this wonderful event. Before I pass the microphone to my colleague and dear friend, Pedro Meira Monteiro, who will introduce our wondrous speaker, the Brazilian historian Sidney Chalhoub, currently chair of Harvard's History Department, and our own, Rafael Cesar, who will be the discussant, I want to say a few words about our beloved friend and historian extraordinaire, Stanley Stein, whose luminous work we are celebrating today with this honorific lecture. Stan joined Princeton's History Department in 1953, and he remained here until he passed away in December 2019, right before turning 100. A champion of Latin American studies at Princeton, in 1967, Stan was appointed as the first director of the program in Latin American Studies, and it's a great, great pleasure to organize this event together with PLAS. Stan wrote extensively on Latin American economic and social history, with a focus on Brazil and Mexico, and always from a rich interdisciplinary perspective. He was indeed a visionary and deeply socially minded field worker. Reflecting on the making of his classic Vassouras, a Brazilian coffee county, first published in 1957, Stan wrote that his objective was, quote, to recreate a sense of ambience, as would a human geographer, integrating soil, topography, climate, and people, to detect networks of community through the lenses of the social anthropologist, to achieve a historian's perception of factors and processes over time. In doing so, quote, he relied upon the primary sources in local archives, supplemented by interviewing surviving ex-enslaved workers. Indeed, a powerful decolonial, anti-colonial, methodological, and epistemic innovation at the time. Stan and his work remains an endless source of inspiration, and we are so grateful to have soon coming to join us today, Peter Stein, his son. He will be with us in a while, and we will have soon Margot and Joel, his daughters, joining us online. And Pedro, the floor is yours now for all of you, and for the ones who will be joining soon online after we fix the Zoom glitches, we are sure going to have a wonderful event. So, Pedro.
Thank you, João. Boa tarde. Good afternoon. It's great to see you all here. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers. I just wanted to reinforce what João just said. I mean, how happy and always moved we are by this lecture, Stanley J. Stein lecture, that is actually a partnership between the program in Latin American Studies and the Brazil Lab and peers. And we're going to have also our colleagues from the PLAS, the Program in Latin American Studies Advisory Council, joining us in a minute or so. And I wanted also to thank, all the Brazil Lab team, Carol Dobb, and Rodrigo, Fabio, Miqueias. And we will hear Sidney Chalhoub first, and then our own Rafael Cesar will be the discussant, and as João mentioned. Sidney Chalhoub is David and Peggy Rockefeller Professor of History and of African and African American Studies, and there are many ands here, chair of the History Department at Harvard University, where he is also affiliated with the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures. He also is a retired emeritus professor at the University of Campinas, Unicamp, my alma mater. Sidney's research focuses on the social history of Brazil in the 19th and early 20th centuries, with emphasis on the history of slavery, race, public health, and the literature of Machado de Assis, a writer of African descent, widely regarded, as we know, as the most important Brazilian novelist of all times. Sidney Chalhoub is the author of award-winning books, three of them on the social history of Rio de Janeiro, Trabalho, Lar e Botequim from 1986, Visões da Liberdade, 1990, and Cidade Febril, 1996. He also wrote this beautiful book, Machado de Assis, Historiador, Machado de Assis, Historian, quite a provocation for us, which is about the literature and political ideas of Machado de Assis. And his most recent book is A Força da Escravidão, Ilegalidade e Costume no Brasil Oitocentista from 2012, which is on illegal enslavement and the precariousness of freedom in 19th century Brazil. The title of his talk today is Gender, Slavery, and Race in 19th Century Brazil, Historical Reflections on Machado de Assis, and it's part of an ongoing investigation which should result in a book to be published first in English and then in Portuguese. It's not the first time we have Sidney here collaborating with peers and PLAS. Much before the Brazil Lab existed in 2009, Sidney Chalhoub, Dane Borges, a fellow historian of the University of Chicago, and I organized a whole week conference on Machado de Assis. A group of 20 scholars on Machado spent 2 days here in Princeton and 2 days in Chicago, and the Princeton part of this wonderful week was funded by peers and PLAS. So we have a sort of one of the many branches of the prehistory of the Brazil Lab, if I may say so. And we have our own and dear Rafael Cesar, who just joined the Princeton faculty with a PhD in Spanish and Portuguese from NYU. Rafael is an assistant professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. He's also affiliated with PLAS, with the Brazil Lab, peers, and with the Department of African American Studies at Princeton. His research focuses on racial imaginaries and race relations from a transatlantic perspective. He works comparatively with African and Afro-diasporic history, popular cultures, cultural production, both literature and cinema, gender relations, and political thought. More specifically, he works on the social and cultural production of history and memory in Portuguese-speaking Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe. It's always good to remind you of this large part of the Portuguese-speaking world, and Portugal, and Brazil, and Cuba, and the USA. In his current book project, Rafael examines the racial imagination in 20th century Angolan nationalism, and the title of his manuscript is Fictions of Racelessness, the Latin American Racial Imaginaries of Angola, 1878-2002. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome our speakers and extend our warmest welcome to Sidney Chalhoub.
So thank you, Pedro. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Speaking in an event to honor the memory of Stanley Stein is really special. When I was a graduate student in the early 1980s, Stanley Stein's book on Vassouras was the book that all of us had to read. This was a time when graduate studying history in Brazil was being reorganized after the dictatorship. And there was a lot of energy to go to the local archives. And Stein's book was a constant source of inspiration for all of us. All right. So let me begin offering some observations about reading literature from the perspective of a social historian. I define social history quite simply as the study of what people do with what is done to them, with due attention to structures of power that condition and limit the agency of subordinated or subaltern peoples. As to the literature I'm speaking about, it is mostly the 19th century novel, but also other literary genres, such as short stories, which is what we'll be speaking about today, and chronicas, for example. Three characteristics of this specific type of fictional text, the 19th century novel, are important here for my purposes. First, the novel is a non-referential narrative text. It is non-referential because it adopts a form of speech that presupposes the emancipation of the text in relation to any specific body of data. It functions independently of the citation of or reference to facts or events existing outside the text itself. It creates a world that refers only to itself, disconnected from the reality to which it alludes and may allegorize, but does not incorporate into the text in the sense that it should be brought in with precision or in a transparent fashion. It presupposes a pact with readers, according to which they, the readers, know that the facts related in the novel are all invented, neither false nor real, but simply made up. I said no referential narrative text because narrative voices or fictional narrators in these novels are created in ways that require an inquiry into the complex relation between the empirical author and the fictional one. As a historian, I'm interested in the question of the relation and possible distance between authorial and fictional voices in 19th century literature. Although we know that authors are not an essence and modulate discourse according to specific circumstances, referential texts do not normally raise the issue of a purposeful construction of a narrative voice that represents an alterity in relation to the empirical author's sense of self. The third question, which I call the third evidence of fictionality, is the creation of situations in the story in which the characters' minds are revealed to the author. The fictional author has access to the thoughts that characters are thinking in ways that writers of history cannot ever dream of having or claiming to have. Despite the rupture that the 19th century novel established in relation to reality per se, or precisely because of that rupture, novelists at the time believed that the ideal of literature was to be truer than the truth. Dom Casmurro, the narrator, once said that a verossimilhança é muita vez toda a verdade, or the appearance of the truth is often the whole of the truth, meaning that an invented story that has the plausibility or the appearance of the truth is the whole truth you can get. Dom Casmurro knew very well that what readers would consider in their evaluation of his story would be whether it appeared to be true, that it was possible to imagine that the events being invented could have happened or could still happen in reality. Plausibility over verisimilitude was the main criteria for the appreciation and validation of 19th century novels. It made these literary texts radically disconnected from reality while remaining deeply embedded in history. So we come to the historian's challenge in reading fictional texts. How to write texts of historical interpretation through the analysis of fictional texts. It happens that the challenge of historical interpretation is the demonstration of plausibility, the gathering and articulation of evidence showing that a certain explanation was possible according to the evidence available. Precisely because of its non-referentiality, but intent to achieve verisimilitude, the 19th century novel carries a wealth of possibilities for the historian. The social logic of the literary text remains there to be teased out once you give up any illusion regarding the transparent or ontological nature of fictional worlds. The question that moves me is the following: how could a certain story be imagined? What was there out in the world that allowed it to be invented? What history, what social logic is embedded in the literary text, structuring it somewhat independently of authorial intent? Or, to what extent does a fictional text reveal, transcend, or even contradict authorial intent? Now, I'm going to speak mostly about Machado's short story. This is a long project that basically tries to understand a specific Machado novel, which is Quincas Borba. And one of the things that I try to do is to try to understand Quincas Borba's narrator through Machado's experimentation in the short stories that he wrote and published in the 1880s. And so now we're kind of going to visit Machado's short fiction workshop. Machado is used to open his collections of short stories. He published 7 in all, addressing readers directly in brief texts that he called warning, except on one occasion in which he entitled it Preface, and another in which there is no such opening. In general, these forewords present 2 features that are somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, pointing out that the tales had been originally published in the daily press or other general interest periodicals, he would claim that they are the most unambitious stories in the world. Look at me, right? When I'm quoting, I'm going to do this instead of saying quote unquote because it's too boring. Quickly jotted down as simply a way of passing the time. The reason for writing them was indeed hope. For when someone tells a story, our spirits lift, time races by, and the story of life ends without any of us noticing. On the other hand, affirming the lack of ambition of the stories comes with veiled suggestions to spend some time on the tales, to seek relevant meanings in them. Collected Pages, Páginas Recolhidas for 1899, opens with a passage from Montaigne. Quote, "Whatever various herbs you use, they are all swallowed up beneath the name of salad." Approaching the volume of selected short stories to the concept of a salad reveals 2 things about it: diversity and unit. It implies that a good salad is more than the sum of the different types of ingredients that it contains. Perhaps the best excerpt from this small gallery of forewords is the opening paragraph of miscellaneous papers, papéis avulsos, so much easier in Portuguese. Instead of saying miscellaneous, papéis avulsos. Quote, "The title, Miscellaneous Papers, might seem to deny this book a certain unity, leading the reader to believe that the author has gathered together various writings of a diverse nature simply in order not to lose them. This is indeed the truth, but not quite the truth. Miscellaneous they are, but they did not come to this place like travelers who just happened to find themselves staying at the same inn. They are persons drawn from the same family, obliged by their father to sit at the same table." Therefore, according to Machado, despite the variety of their contents, his short story volumes constitute a certain unit. The texts in them belong to the same family. Indeed, it has been shown about at least two of these collections the careful observation of the transposition of the tales from periodicals to the volumes, including as regards the chronology of their production, suggests that at some point, Machado, the author, saw the book, thus beginning to compose stories that, however published originally in the periodicals, would necessarily be included in the volume. In a dated story, the story Sendata from 1884, the foreword begins with the remark that the title seems unintelligible or vague, since, with two exceptions, all the stories carried dates. Machado proceeds as follows. Supposing, however, that my purpose is to define these pages as dealing in substance with things that do not belong to any particular date or time, that, I think, would explain the title, which is the worst thing that could possibly happen to it, for the best titles are always those that need no explanation. Stories that do not pertain to a given time can be thought to address structural, long-term issues of a society, themes that highlight continuities in historical experience. However much several of the tales read as philosophical satires, full of twisted moralizing sketches, peopled with God, the devil, lost souls, crazy ones, sages, etc., it's not difficult to see the centrality of gender issues in several of them. Untold Stories offers an inventory of social representations about tensions and conflicts associated with questions of gender. Two procedures inform such inventory. First, the point of view of the narrative voices is markedly seigneurial in the sense of 19th century Brazilian society. As I will attempt to show, they are all men who consider themselves white and enlightened, whose worldviews are shaped and limited by their experiences as wealthy owners of urban property and masters of enslaved and other dependent free and freed people. Furthermore, they imagine themselves as controllers of a domestic world in which women are seen as social adornment and assets to carry out family alliances and achieve social distinction. Second, despite the regularity of addiction that assumes superiority over others, who are the objects of allegedly refined, ironic remarks characterized by prejudices of class, gender, and race, sometimes humorously asserted, other times embedded and unsuspected by the narrators, the perspective of subordinated characters, women in particular, do become available to readers. In other words, the following short stories seem particularly amenable to interpretations focused on the social history of gender relations or on the question of how Machado represented the ways in which women of different social conditions dealt with their subordination to seigneurial patriarchal figures and storytellers. Just a quick word about the title of the talk is, of course, a fraud. It's called Gender, Slavery, and Race, 19th Century Literature, Machado de Assis. I didn't know what I wanted to talk about when I received the invitation. And so I gave a title that I couldn't escape some of these things I'd be speaking about. And actually, it's about gender, right? Today, I could be speaking about other things, but I chose gender in the end. So it's like the opposite of Machado's suggestion about a title, which it should not explain much. So when you explain too much, you lie, right, in the title. So now I'm going to dive into two short stories. The text itself, I analyzed three, but I won't have time to go through more than two of those stories. The social scenarios depicted in the stories scattered in Untold undated stories, stories sem data, are very diverse. There appearing several pertaining to the wealthy urban milieu that is common in Machado's novels. However, among others, there is also a tale about a clandestine love affair between characters belonging to different social classes, and another about a young working class couple. The latter, Admiral's Night, tells the story of Deolindo Big Nose, a sailor in love with Genoveva, quote, a charming, dusky skinned country girl, 20 years of age, clever, with dark, mischievous eyes. Quote. Deolindo had to go on a training voyage, 10 months in the sea. The lovers had sworn to remain faithful to each other. Farewell, tears, saudade. Months later, nonetheless, Deolindo is still absent. Genoveva falls madly in love with a peddler. Although she claims to have resisted the new suitor's initial advances, one day, without knowing how, she had woken up in love with him. This is the way she explains herself to Deolindo when the sailor appears at her door, already aware of the fact that he had lost his girlfriend. Thus he comes with his brain in convulsion, just quote, like a storm at sea, amid howling winds and shrieking whistles, picturing his sailor's knife, blooded and vengeful. Unquote. Genoveva says that when she had sworn her love to Deolindo, she had been truthful to her feelings, but that, quote, the hurt changes as mine did. According to the narrator, she, quote, wasn't excusing herself for making a mistake or breaking an oath. She wasn't excusing herself for anything at all. She had no moral compass for her actions. Further in the text, still struggling to understand the woman's conduct, he observes, seemingly addressing a generic reader, quote, note that here we are very close to unvarnished nature. Although the tension about a possible violent outcome hovers over almost the whole story, all ends well. Deolindo leaves, sad and disappointed, but he does not tell his shipmates about his misfortune, allowing them to think that he had had an admiral's night with Genoveva. The narrator builds a social distance in regards to the characters in several ways. To begin with, the sailor's nickname and the woman's characterization as caboclinha suggest that they are persons of color. Genoveva's case is straightforward since she is referred to with a Portuguese word that indicates miscegenation, caboclinha. Deolindo's nickname, Venta Grande, is not exactly big nose, but big nostril. One translator chooses to say Deolindo nostrils. In 19th century race science, noses were for thinking. There was the idea that the appearance and size of noses expressed the racial superiority or inferiority of human groups. Europeans with supposedly long and thin noses were allegedly superior to Africans and people of African descent with noses perceived as thick or flattened, featuring wide or big nostrils. The Dutch anatomist Petrus Kemper had discovered the facial angle and the nasal index in the end of the 18th century, thus inventing the pseudoscience of the racial nose. African peoples with supposed flattened noses had their appearance likened to that of primates. In addition, the narrator postulates his difference vis-a-vis the characters, attributing to them a civilizational deficit, a lack of cultural sophistication that made them closer to nature. They were people governed by their instincts. When Deolindo learns that Genoveva has a new boyfriend, he becomes choleric. As the sailor leaves to search for the woman, the narrator seems to struggle to describe what the character has in his mind in this moment of crisis. A scenario figure who felt betrayed by his girlfriend would likely lose control as well in a similar situation. But he would frame his reaction in a duty to save his honor, for an, quote, insult ought to be washed away with blood, if blood ever washed away anything in the world. As Brás Cubas, a wealthy owner of urban real estate and enslaved people, once said, satirizing his own class bias. The potential for male violence is the customary one across social classes, though Brás and his ilk would evoke need to affirm codes of honor to justify their acts. As for Deolindo, according to the storyteller, quote, I won't say what he was thinking, for he wasn't thinking anything at all, quote, except for the image of his sailor's knife, blooded and vengeful. Unquote. Moreover, since he did not carry his knife, quote, he could still strangle Genoveva with his bare hands. She was a tiny slip of a thing, and for the first few minutes, he could think of nothing else. Quote. A few lines below, Deolindo asks about his rival because he wanted to kill the peddler. Unquote. Regarding Genoveva, at first sight, it appears that she is not able to exercise control over her own feelings. As already seen, the explanation that she gives for her change of heart about Deolindo, therefore falling in love with the peddler, is that one day, quote, she had woken up in love with him, unquote. The narrator tries to understand Genoveva's attitude, but he seems unable to find the right words. He mentions several possibilities: candor and cynicism, insolence and simplicity. These are all quoted words. Then he decides that cynicism and insolence do not apply to the young woman's conduct. The superiority of the narrator is also asserted as a matter of aesthetics of consumption. At a certain moment of their conversation, Genoveva doubts Deolindo's reassurances that he had remained faithful to her during the several months of his training voyage. Quote, had he thought about her in every single place he went? Unquote. Deolindo responds, giving her a package that he brought with him full of trinkets that he had gathered to give to her. She comes upon a pair of earrings that the narrator describes as not expensive, they couldn't be, and, quote, rather tasteless, but they were really striking. In other words, according to the storyteller, the earrings that Deolindo offers to Genoveva as a gift are cheap, of bad taste and kitsch. Nonetheless, quote, dazzled and contented, Genoveva goes straight to the cheap mirror hanging on the wall to gauge their effect. Stepping back and forth, turning her head left and right. When a neighbor arrives, she shows the earrings to her, saying that they are really sweet. The Portuguese word in the original is engraçado. According to the most used dictionary of the language in the 19th century, the confusion between the words gracioso and engraçado was common at the time. The first meant graceful. Gracioso means graceful or elegant. The second, engraçado, meant funny or ridiculous. Therefore, the narrator surreptitiously derides his characters once more, dubbing the earrings ridiculous, while the women found them elegant, but they used the wrong word. The vision of the storyteller about Genoveva can be contradicted by observing his own words. It suffices to read them slowly and against or beyond his intentions. For example, I mentioned above that the narrator uses the following words to describe the young woman's behavior: candor and cynicism, insolence and simplicity, deployed in pairs, as shown here. Nevertheless, he seems to realize that one can be either sincere or cynical, not both. So he withdraws the word cynicism. Likewise, someone can be insolent or humble, not both. So he excludes the idea of insolence. The result, not highlighted by the narrator, is that Genoveva is a sincere and simple person. Indeed, she does not argue anything different from this in her defense. She says to Deolindo from the beginning that she had fallen in love with the other man, claiming that she is telling the truth. Quote, as if I was telling the priest. Unquote. The word true, or an equivalent one, in fact, appears in Genoveva's utterances several times. When summarizing a part of what she had said to Deolindo, the narrator says thus: once the peddler had supplanted the sailor, then reason was on the peddler's side, and it was only right to say so. When Deolindo complains that she had sworn to remain faithful to him, Genoveva replies, quote, all right, yes, Deolindo, that's true. When I swore it, it was true. It was so true that I wanted to run far, far away with you, where no one would find us. God knows it was true. But then other things came along. This other young man came along, and I took a shine on him. Genoveva says the word true 4 times in 3 lines. She seems to articulate a moral vision about how to behave in romantic relationships, based on the notion that the right way to proceed is to be faithful to one's sentiments. Quote, the heart changes as mine did. However, before assuming that whatever Genoveva says can be taken at face value, as if she were always speaking her mind to others, it is useful to remark on a couple of passages in which the narrator allows us to see, without his realizing it, some strategic maneuvers of the young woman. For instance, when she invites Deolindo to enter her home, certainly warning readers who knew that the sailor came with a bloody knife in his brain, the storyteller mentions in passing, as if not really registering in his mind, that, quote, Genoveva left the door open, unquote. Genoveva is careful and guarantees that she has an escape route in case she loses control of the situation and the man turns violent. The episode is a clue to the contrast between the scenario male narrator who mentions an action the meaning of which he does not understand, and the female character who cannot not know for a minute the threat to her physical integrity represented by a distressed former lover. The scene at the beginning of the story in which Deolindo and Genoveva take an oath of fidelity to each other is probably the most revealing one concerning the young woman's need to deal cautiously and strategically with the pressures and dangers of love relationships. It is referring to this episode, incidentally, that she makes the short speech in which the word true appears 4 times. So many times that it looks as if readers are being invited to return to the passage. The 2 lovers are about to be separated for many months, and they pronounce their oaths as follows, quote, I swear by God in heaven, and you, me too, say it properly. I swear by God in heaven, may the light fail me at the hour of my death. Fail me at the hour of my death, unquote. During his conversation with Genoveva after his return, Deolindo repeats to her the exact wording of her oath, as if its enhanced formality makes it more sacred, a further assurance of the girlfriend's obligation to remain faithful. Rereading it, though, what calls attention is the young woman's first utterance, which is short, perhaps an attempt to escape from the solemnity that the other requires of her. Me too. Only after Deolindo's further prodding does she say the oath in a way that is suspiciously profuse. May the light fail me at the hour of my death. Quote. It seems that Genoveva and Deolindo interpret the oath differently. However truthful Genoveva's commitment at that moment, her understanding of the oath contrasts sharply with Deolindo's. She swears to love him for as long as her sentiment for him lasts. He expects the oath to create an eternal obligation, as the narrator explains. Disconsolate, Deolindo adds, quote, that's exactly why people swear things, so that they don't fall in love with someone else, unquote. Because the narrator has a condescending view towards his characters, whom he sees as lacking in civilized manners, and because he shares with Deolindo the notion of male entitlement and supposedly legitimate violence against women, he does not understand Genoveva's articulation of a concept of female honor that values faithfulness to her own sentiments at all times, not a necessary and eternal bond with a given man. I'm worried about time. For how long am I speaking? Can anybody tell me? 35 or 40, that's important. Okay, I'm going to accelerate a little bit in the last story. In the second story I'm going to talk about so that we have enough time for a conversation. The story is chapter on hats. And there is again a third person narrator in that story. However, unlike what happens in Admiral's Night, he seems to be very fluent, this narrator seems to be very fluent in the cultural assumptions and prejudices pertaining to the characters in the story, who are all members of the seigneurial slaveholding class. The tale begins with Mariana asking Conrado, her husband and a lawyer, to stop going downtown wearing a lightweight flat hat that he had had for the past 5 or 6 years. Her father, a very traditional man, had told her in private that such a hat did not belong to a distinguished gentleman. According to him, it was the abomination of abominations, and her daughter should banish it in favor of a top hat. Mariana obliges and approaches her husband carefully on the subject, but he tells her not to be silly. This is what follows. I'm going to read that passage and then try to summarize my arguments because I don't have time to develop things in detail. But that first paragraph is important. I'm citing. I'm quoting. Conrado struck a match, lit his cigarette, and tried to change the subject with an ineffable wave of his hand. But his wife persisted, and her insistence, at first gently imploring, quickly became harsh and imperious. Conrado was shocked. He knew his wife. She was usually such a passive creature, sweet and gently, amenable as the situation demanded, capable of wearing a bonnet, a wimple, or a royal tiara with the same tiara, maybe, with the same divine indifference. The proof of this is that, having been part of a rather fast set during the 2 years before marrying, once she did marry, she quickly settled in homelier habits. She did go out from time to time, mainly at the behest of her husband, but she was only truly at ease in her own home. Furniture, curtains, and ornaments made up for the lack of children. She loved them like a mother, and such was the harmony between person and surroundings that she took particular pleasure in everything being in its proper place, the curtains hanging in the same neat folds, and so on. Her mental habits were equally uniform. Mariana possessed very few ideas and read only the same books again and again, Macedo's Moreninhas 7 times, Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, and the Pirates 10 times each, Le Mot de l'Énigme and Madame Cravon 11 times. End of quote. At the beginning of the paragraph, it is clearly the husband who is thinking of his wife as a passive creature, amenable to different situations. Nevertheless, as the text continues, the types of details offered do not seem of the kind that a husband would refer to describing his wife. Attention to furniture and other house objects as making up for the lack of children, describing mental habits as uniform, and knowing with precision the number of times Mariana had read certain romantic novels, and only them, all suggest that it is the omniscient third-person narrator who is providing such information so as to better delineate the fictional character. The uncertain boundaries between what the husband is thinking of his wife and what the narrator says to describe her way of being, without any clue in the text of a rupture or even of different nuances between the ideas of the two men regarding Mariana, seems to imply that they share the same seemingly favorable vision of the wife's supposed passivity. I know I'm really challenging you because if you are like one of Machado's characters, Dona Ursula in Helena, Helena offers to read her novels, and Dona Ursula says, no, I haven't, because my eyes are more intelligent than my ears. And I'm really challenging the intelligence of your ears, right? Especially these days in which all talks are followed with PowerPoints and all those images, and I'm offering you nothing, just my words, which is a real challenge. Now, how does chapter on hats, continue? Mariana is angry because her husband actually, in the following passage, makes fun of her. He says that, you don't understand anything about hats. There is even a science of hats these days, proving that it's not the hat that is a compliment to men, but perhaps even it is the case that it's men that compliment hats. And he makes fun of her, he humiliates her in all ways. And she's really angry. He goes to work, and then she thinks she needs to do something to wear, to vent or whatever. And then she goes visit a friend, Sophia. Sophia is basically a flirt. She is married. According to the narrator, she's not unfaithful to her husband, but she really is a flirt. She goes to Rua do Ouvidor, and she, flirts left and right all the time. And then they go together. And then Machado uses very skillfully the fact that this story is serialized in a periodical. So Mariana is really angry and go out with her friend who is a flirt. She's angry with her husband. And then the story is published in 3 parts. The first part cuts when Mariana is going to Rua do Ouvidor with Sophia, thinking that I want to have fun. And you start thinking about, adultery. And then the story breaks and only comes back 2 weeks later. 2 weeks later, the story continues, and then it breaks again when Mariana and Sophia, the other woman, they are in the dentist. I don't know how people go out to have fun in Rua do Ouvidor and they end up in a dentist. It's completely crazy. But they are there in the dentist, and then a man comes up, a gentleman, with 2 other women, and this man goes straight to Mariana. And the narrator explains that this man was Mariana's first boyfriend. And then the story breaks again. And this was published in a woman's magazine. So the readers will have another 2 weeks to think that Mariana, angry with her husband, is perhaps going to be unfaithful to him with the first boyfriend. So he uses very skillfully this serialized nature of these texts to suggest an agency that woman agency can be dangerous, can go to dangerous places. And then in the end of the story, Mariana goes up and down Rua do Vidor, goes to the Chamber of Deputies, and she is really tired after all. After all this. I mean, she really desires to go back to her peaceful domestic life, and she thinks that was silly to insist on my husband's changing the hat and so on. Then she goes back home. She's again very happy to be home, and she's waiting for her husband to mend things with him. And then when he arrives, in the serialized version, he arrives with the same flattened hat that he was wearing before. And the story ends there. But in the book, Machado changes the ending. It's exactly the opposite. He comes home with the top hat that Mariana wanted him to wear, right? But when Mariana sees him with the top hat, she thinks, oh no, it doesn't look good. Right? And then when she comes here, she embraces him, kisses him, and says, can you go back to the old hat? And the story ends there. The whole thing suggests, of course, what's going to happen, this is implied, is that the husband who had changed it from the flat hat to the top hat is going to go back to first change it from the flat hat to the top hat because Mariana insisted. And then he's going to go back to the flat hat because Mariana changed her mind. Right? It is interesting because I think the change of the ending has to do with this passage from periodical to book, because in the book form, Machado lost the resource, the opportunity to use the breaks in the serialized form to suggest dangerous human agency, right? Or the power of human agency. Since in the book he doesn't have that possibility, then he tried, I think, this is my interpretation, to enhance the dimension of women agency by showing her power to make him change the hat and then even go back to the old hat when she changes her mind. Well, summarized like this, of course, it's not nearly as sophisticated as it is in the text. So you can read the text in the future. I will jump to the conclusion. But let me see. Okay, the conclusion is pretty short. I can read it if I find it. Okay. Toni Morrison, and it's fitting to finish talk about Machado in Princeton, citing Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison remarked regarding the formation of 19th century U.S. literary canon that the Black presence or the presence of race is embedded in narrative choices, language, structures, and meanings. That is, the topic is not very apparent on the surface of fictional texts. She proceeds to argue that there is no direct relation between the space race occupies on the surface of texts and its structuring power to shape narratives. She calls race, quote, the ghost in the literary machine. I would like to appropriate Toni Morrison's insight for the interpretation of Machado's essays, but giving it a certain twist. Beginning with the posthumous memoirs, probably earlier in some short stories, Machado's essays set out to create narrators who were a radical authority in relation to himself. It was a very deliberate, clear-minded procedure, although, of course, he did not and could not control many of the forms and meanings that this literary project would lead him to. Once the idea is in motion, it gains a life of its own. It spins out of control. It takes unpredictable turns. The core idea is to create, one after another, narrators who are scenario figures slave-holding men of wealth, white supremacists, misogynists, but cultivated and seducing, according to the patterns of a certain social class and the expectations of a significant number of expected readers of these stories. None of this is exactly new, although it entails the possibility of reading Machado's fiction as a social history archive. The concept of the archive for contemporary social historians interested in the experience of subordinate or subaltern peoples means dealing with incompleteness, silences, ambiguities, disguises, a whole array of indeterminacies that need to be approached by the disciplined, empirically grounded power of the historian's imagination. Quite often, social historians thrive when they manage to read historical sources teasing out exactly what their authors or producers fail to understand or seek to silence. And this is why it is productive to think of Machado's fiction as a social history archive, among so many other things.
Thank you, Sidney, for your insightful paper and for sharing it with us. And thanks also to Brazil Lab for the invitation to be a discussant today. I'm not even close to being an expert on Machado de Assis like Sidney, but let's see if I can bring some ideas to kick off a conversation with the audience. So there are several aspects that interest me in Sidney's presentation, but above all, the idea of Machado's fiction as archive. Of course, historians have been using literature as a form of historical document or historical reference, with all the necessary caveat because it is fiction. But in the last decades, historians also increased their suspicions and became more careful when interrogating also the traditional historical sources. And I will enter some dangerous terrain. I've been warned about that. But because, after all, there is no such thing as a pure, and I repeat, pure historical fact, event, or truth. I know it is dangerous to say so in times of fake news, and the astonishingly fast progress in artificial intelligence development is very scary to me. But I believe this room is a safe space to say that there is no such a thing as a pure historical event. What I mean is that, to a great extent, the apprehension of historical events or contexts, not unlike literature, is necessarily mediated by language, by representation, be it a narrative of a first-hand account, a narrative put together by a historian who previously selects what they considers to be the most important aspects or accounts, or finally, the language of documents themselves, necessarily shaped by a context, interest, power dynamics, in some politics. The mediation of language does not, and I repeat, does not erase the differences between fact and fiction, but certainly bring history and literature closer together. And this understanding gives us tools to better inquire history. Being constituted, and just to be clear, this is not like a solipsistic take on like that only exists what is from our mind, right? But these differences exist, but they are mediated, as I was suggesting here. So being constituted by and through the politics of past and present is the existential condition of the archive, which in turn deepens the possibilities of reading Machado historically, not as a flat historical reference or document, but, as Sidney put, an archive that can be explored not only in what it says, but also in what it silences about, as it embeds, and here's, I think, the key word, the social logic of its time. This is Sidney's term. And this is my main interest here, and why apparently Machado has been immensely productive for inquiring the Brazilian society of the late 19th century. Not as much for what he says, but how he says it. Not what he writes about, but perhaps, if I may, the performance of his writing. So Sidney's paper focused on gender relations, but race is also a good way to illustrate this idea. And I'll actually first recall an anecdote. In the early 2000s, a Brazilian public bank advertisement featured a fictional Machado de Assis. The scene was set in the late 1800s, and an old Machado makes a deposit in his savings account, this old notebook that you actually wrote down how much it was deposited. He makes this a deposit in the deposit in the savings account he had in this public bank from this advertisement. This was a historical truth. Machado did have a savings account with this bank, and the advertisement's idea was to instill trust in the population who could safely save their money with them in the early 2000s, just like Machado had done more than 100 years before. This was also a way of taking part in the national history. That was something that was also being offered to the population. So in spite of those historical references, the part that was not historically true was that in the ad, Machado was played by a blue-eyed, white, very fair-skinned actor with slightly blushed cheeks, with a peaceful, good-hearted look, a kind of Santa Claus-inspired figure. Although there were important differences between the social possibilities of pre-abolition free people of color and people of color in the 2000s, and in many ways, I think there could have even more possibilities in the pre-abolition period, but this is something else. The ad revealed a longue-durée social logics of Brazil. The country's most important writer could not be a person of color, neither in the 1800s, neither in the early 2000s. At the time the advertisement was aired, there was no Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, such beautiful times, but race consciousness was on the rise in Brazil, and the newspapers were flooded with letters protesting against the whitening of Machado. Soon, the ad was dropped and remade with an actor who looked more or less like me. This is a perfect allegory of the transformations Machado has been through in his life and his afterlife. He was born brown, lightened through his life, buried white, and is being darkened again in the last 2 decades or so. This social logic conditioned Machado's writings when it comes to race. In a deeply hostile environment for Black people, with the political polarization around the abolitionist cause, so strong that it eventually led to the monarchy's overthrow, and the prevalence of eugenics discourse that urged for the demographic elimination of the Black population through massive European immigration, how could Machado, whose social and political position were always at a greater risk for his Blackness, how could this brown man write in favor of his brothers and sisters? For many years, Machado was considered neglectful about race and slavery and solely concerned with the Brazilian upper classes and therefore with white people in a certain sense. But a more refined reading from Black scholars more recently has shown that Machado's well-known irony and sarcastic voice applied also to a deeper criticism to the way these classes treated the Black population and enslaved population. And in addition to some more clear criticism, such as the scene about the enslaved boy in Memórias Póstumas de Brás Cubas, short stories such as Pai contra Mãe, and several newspapers chronicles that Machado wrote, frequently using a different pen name, it was in the abundance of silence and negations that Machado de Assis spoke out. At a time when negative, stereotypical portrayals of Black people were common language, Machado de Assis barely ever wrote about Black people in such a way. Compare, for example, with Bernardo Guimarães, Aloysio de Azevedo, among other authors from his time. It is this contrast, this abundance of silence that marked a strong position at the time and offers us today other perspectives about that time. But this abundance of silence can only be seen or can only be heard as a loud voice if we understand the social logic of that time. It is what allows us to see Machado's performative writing again, if I may, or his ethics, writing ethics, maybe. I'm just trying this here. This is what the Brazilian scholar Eduardo de Assis Duarte called the snail strategy, the small animal, as a reference to Machado's capacity to hide ideas or himself inside the shell, but still place them where he wanted to. The situation with gender, the main category Sidney explored today, is somewhat similar, and I say somewhat because different intersectional positions also produce different possibilities or impossibilities to speak. And in the case of Machado, when it comes to gender relations, it is impossible not to think, of course, about the well-known disruptive interpretation of Dom Casmurro, originally by Helen Caldwell, that Capitu did not or not necessarily committed adultery, given that Dom Casmurro is narrated in first person. In fact, that changed the interpretation of Dom Casmurro from being the story about an unfaithful woman and a suffering man to that of a disturbed man's mind, perhaps, and an unfairly treated woman. This may be commonplace today, but my point is that I believe this perspective on Machado inform other readings of his archive, including the snail strategy about race relations and Sidney's reading. And finally, going back to Sidney's presentation, I was thinking that if the key to this reading of Dom Casmurro that I just mentioned is the first-person perspective, so not an omniscient narrator, it looks to me that in Sidney's paper deepens this approach by reading with similar eyes narratives about gender relations in the third person, with a third-person narrator, including Singular Evento, the one about Marola, even though the unnamed man in the dialogue is a non-omniscient third-person narrator. And we could discuss if he is a third-person narrator or a character narrating a story, but I would be inclined to say he's a disguised narrator. And this is a clever choice by Sidney because it forces us and him to find other reading keys from this tradition of reading Machado, including, for example, as he mentioned, the inconclusive situation in the history of the hat, the serialization, changes in the editions, and so forth. So all that said, I think I'm already run over time. I would have, Sidney, two questions for you, or perhaps one I would suggest or ask you to perhaps, if you're interested in that, in talking more about this notion of archive in Machado, because I think, of course, archive is a hot topic, has been for some years and still is. And I also wanted to bring another question. So we're thinking about the way Machado is then more or less bringing different perspectives on gender that were uncommon from his time. So to a certain extent, also speaking what could be the voice of, not the voice of women, but more or less on behalf of women. I'm going to explain that better. But considering Machado's position, I actually wanted to ask, what are the limits of his speech, right? So if the subaltern, and particularly the subaltern woman, cannot speak, can Machado speak on their behalf? I think that is my question. What is Machado perhaps not able to speak on their behalf, considering this the intersectional position that he is in, which perhaps through, for example, if we think about this rethinking of race in Machado, that obviously opens up for perhaps solidarity with other forms of oppression from his time, but also being a man, right? So what does he say and what does he not say that is in the text or is not in the text? And finally, if you also want to comment something else, I was also wondering, from the perspective of a social historian, how does race impact patriarchalism in this slave-holding or slavocrat society? Of course, relation between a white man and a black woman this would be very clear, but the stories you chose have three different kinds of women. There is a white woman who is suggested as a prostitute, a poor mixed race woman, and an upper class white woman. So my question is, how does this context of slaveholding society impacts patriarchalism between these mostly white men, with the exception of I forgot his name, Deolindo Ventagrande, or even between people of color? Thank you so much for reading.
Okay, Sidney, you have the floor, and then I suggest we all sit here, and then we will open up to the floor.
Well, my name is here, so I'm just following my name. Okay, so thank you. These are big questions, so I have another half hour, right? No, yeah, I mean the question of the archive is really important because, you know, as a social historian, the first thing you learn is that most of the time you are dealing with historical sources that have as its main protocol, even though there are different types of sources, different types of narratives, depending on the source you are using. When you're talking about subaltern peoples, enslaved people, and workers, as is my case in all of my whole career, these are all documents that objectify these subjects, right? These are I've written 3 books using mostly criminal trial records, 2 of them entirely on almost entirely with criminal trial records, and also civil records. And these are sources that speak about these people only with the intent of making them an object of repression, of disciplining, and so on. And the only way you can see how these sources allow you to get at some of the characteristics of and experiences of these people, these sources are speaking about, is to read the information that usually the authors of these narratives do not intend to give to you. Right? This is an assumption of your work. If you're reading on the transparency of things, you can do very little, right? So you need to read against the intent of the narrators you're reading. So, for example, I'm going to give an example from not from my work, but from a work of a colleague of mine that I followed at that time in the 1980s. You know, when we began using these sources and developing together a methodology of reading them. And this was a colleague, Marta Abreu, who was doing a work on concepts of female honor among the popular classes, working classes in Rio. And she started reading deflowering cases of men being accused of deflowering women who lost their virginity. Most often, not most, but very often, these women got pregnant, and then the family forces to go the girl to go to the police, and a criminal procedure is opened against the man, and reparations could be made through marriage, or there would be a criminal case, in arrest and so on. But it's interesting because the judges were always examining not what the men had done, but they were always after understanding whether the women had followed a certain expectation of conduct. So, for example, if there was sex before marriage, why did it happen? Is that a justification? Did he promise marriage? Did you have a reasonable expectation to be married to this person? And you are somehow anticipating something that is coming, and that somehow justifies what's happening? Does this girl have an honest type of behavior? For example, do they go out alone with the boyfriends, or they are always with someone of the family when they see the boyfriend and so on? All the questions that are informing the judge were based on a code of honor that had nothing to do with his working women. How can you say, to a working woman that they cannot be out on the streets alone at night? They work and then come back, and how can you expect them not to be with other men alone on the streets, right? Living in these neighborhoods where the working classes are numerous, and they are working side by side with men quite often. Marriage, traditionally in Brazil, among the working classes, was a minority thing. Couples got together without getting married. This was the large majority of them in the 19th century. Slaves could not even get married most of the time. So the whole questions that they were asking, right? They would not allow an understanding of what kind of values informed notions such as honesty for that woman. That's why the story of Deolindo really appeals to me, Deolindo and Genoveva, because what the story conveys is that there are different codes of honor. And there you see three perspectives. The perspective of the narrator, who really doesn't understand Genoveva, who is actually defending a concept of female honor that the narrator doesn't get. He just doesn't get, right? Is this idea that her honor has to do with being faithful to the person she actually loves at that moment. That doesn't have anything to do with being faithful or loving someone for her whole life. The narrator doesn't get. Deolindo doesn't accept. Deolindo sees that happening all the time, right? I mean, the criminal trial records and the civil records of the time show lots of these informal relationships ending and being accepted, people getting together with others. It's just a usual way, a customary way in which these relations happen in the working classes, right? Yeah, yes, all this stuff. And I think the story, for me, I think I can only read that story the way I do because of the experience of reading Martha Breu's work, or of studying the world of this working class and knowing how the experience of these values are quite different depending on class, race, and the social relations that people are specifically. So the notion of the archive for historians, I mean, the fact is that historians make up their own archives. Let me explain. Next step, I have to explain what that means. There's no such a thing as a complete archive about anything, right? It doesn't have to do, you can be, in the case of subaltern peoples, you are dealing with archives of people who never had a chance to craft narratives of their experiences, aiming posterity. The main difference is that if you're studying an intellectual, a politician, they, at some point in their lives, they start producing documents for posterity. They intend to do that. These people never had that chance. So these are only people who are being spoken about. This is the sense in which the archive to study the working classes and enslaved people are usually very different from archives produced by people situated in different social places. But it's not that, I mean, our archives are incomplete, lacking in information. The historian is always demanded to use their imagination, right? And when I say that we make up our archives, it's because we assemble our archives. You know, get some information in this types of sources, some information in this type of sources, in other types of sources, and then we assemble a corpus, and then we interpret, you know, we offer our interpretation of historical processes and experiences based on this archives we assemble. And interpreting these archives, when I started in the profession, I had the illusion that, you know, I had more to learn reading anthropologists and sociologists and so on. Today, I think my work is more and more similar to the work literary critics do. Although I'm not reading most of the time non-referential texts. I'm reading referential texts, but I'm reading them as texts that have narrators, that are constructing silences, that need to read against the intentions of the authors, and all kinds of procedures that are routine in literary criticism. Yeah. I mean, I still like the anthropologists, but I'm more and more I find more and more productive the dialogue with literary critics, in the sense that, no, look, 20 years ago, you'd come to a situation like this, and Pedro would be in the audience, and I would start provoking him, because I would say, you know, Pedro, everything is history. You know, literary text, everything is history. And then, you know, and he'd start fighting with me. Now I try to buy his goodwill, saying that, look, Pedro, everything is literature. Right? What I'm proposing is we have to read everything as literary, in the sense of things, instability of the narration, the incompleteness of the text, the silences it produces, the necessity to understand form in order to interpret content, and all these procedures that are the bread and butter of literary critics, as I understand it. I may be missing. Look, he's going to respond. Oh my God. But, well, I think I'll stop here because there's a lot of conversation. Right? It's okay? Can I stop here?
Okay, and this is a dead battery, that's why it's not working. We are running out of time, but we actually started a bit late, so let's have at least a round of questions, a bundle of questions, and João always says, bouquet de questões, especially, but not only from the historians, now that we are all literary scholars here. By the way, Sidney used to say something as part of those provocations that Machado, this was a while ago, Machado is too much important a topic to be left for literary scholars, right? So, yeah, he still thinks that. Okay, so João?
Our provocation, so the anthropologist, I will put my anthropologist hat on. So I was very intrigued by the statement you made about the fictional author as an effect of the character. So if you can develop that a little bit more. I was just thinking of the work of Gilles Deleuze and the powers of the false, you know, so I thought it was something very interesting there. But in terms of your provocation about the anthropologists, when you were saying that, I was thinking, how could I just counter that a little bit? For example, the characters that you said, the subaltern characters, right, who do not write, but this does not mean they don't storytell. And they don't tell their story through other medium, prayers, healing recipes, touches. And those things are also forms of archiving that are passed on. So I would say that maybe there is a rich reservoir there that can be tapped on, and that maybe that's a kind of a literature of the unlettered, of the unschooled, that we in the high circles of academia don't have our ears and eyes open to see and listen to.
More questions? I'm looking at the historians there, but they seem to be okay. No? So if I may add just one quick thing, I mean, to what João just said, I mean, how can we think about the reliability? Is this a word? Yeah, the confianza of the narrator when we are also working with those sources. In other words, prayers, etc. I can't think of a truer or a more honest thing than a prayer, right? But at the same time, and how would you, since everything is literature now, I mean, how would you deal with this level of unlettered, so to speak, agency of a narrator, someone who's building a narration based on experience, on what you call social history?
Are there more?
Historians decided to.
Things, thinking about how historians work with sources versus literary scholars. I mean, how, in your method for approaching literature as a historian, do you read and situate Machado in relation to other authors? Because I think one of the things that historians do is, like you said, when you're talking about the, your judicial sources, right? You read a lot of them, and so you understand what makes them similar, the genre, right? The conventions, what's boilerplate and familiar, and what's strange and different. And I'm guessing that literary scholars read a lot of literature, and that's part of where their their ability to analyze the text in a particular way comes from. So as a historian venturing into this, who hasn't spent his entire career presumably reading all the time literature, although I guess you probably read a lot, what are the sort of particular challenges of shifting over that you found?
The first thing about João, about the fictional author and the character, what I'm arguing is that beginning some stories, I think, in the 1870s, and then moving on in the stories in the 1880s. But I know I'm not even talking about first-person narratives like Memórias Póstumas Brás Cubas or Dom Casmurro, because these are first-person narratives and things are more straightforward in that sense. But the question is that when you read a novel like Quincas Borba, which is really a mystery in terms of criticism, there is a lot of struggle to try to understand that novel. And I think I started to understand better what could be done when I started paying more attention to the short stories that were written immediately before he started writing Quincas Borba. Quincas Borba was a challenge to Machado himself. It took him 5 years to write. He got stuck. He started again. He stopped. He rewrote the whole thing. So it was the only novel with which Machado really struggled in terms of finding the right tone, the right structure. And I think part of the challenge was because he was writing this third-person novel with following many of the protocols of the omniscient narrator. And however, his challenge was to make this third-person omniscient narrator a character in the story, in the sense that this narrator is actually manipulating, hiding things from readers, telling lies, and then it's really becomes a character, right? You can't, if you read that story, which is always a third-person narrative in its form, in its content, the narrator is within the story as a character in it. And that changed the whole game in terms of how to interpret the stories. And he was doing that in the short stories. The short stories, that's what it has to do with what I was saying about Toni Morrison. When Toni Morrison is talking about the U.S. 19th century canon, you have all white male, almost all white male authors, and they're speaking a lot about race without race really appearing much on the surface of the novel. But it's a structure. The racial tensions are structuring things. Now, what Machado did was he invented white fictional authors, right? And even when he writes a third-person story with an omniscient narrator, he's imagining this third-person omniscient narrator as a white male. Toni Morrison is speaking about directly authors with these characteristics. Machado is inventing them, right? When he's writing third-person novels. And then I see this as making the narrator a character in the story. Now, you're completely right about these other types of sources that, I think historians have been using. There was this beautiful volume that has to do with Stein's recordings, right? About the jongos and so on, in which actually they were interpreted as important historical sources. These are jongos, right? And we have been using these sources. I think what I wanted to say was that these sources, of course, you can read them as producing a body of document, of sources that transmit from generation to generation, right? But it's still, I think there is a case, it's a different thing from the type of documents produced by individuals aiming this kind of posterity that politicians, intellectuals aim, in which I think these people are not aiming at anything different for a collective than a collective memory. Although this collective memory sometimes praise individuals or episodes too, right? But they are not produced purposefully by the individuals which gives this illusion that when you're talking about elites, the archives are more complete, which just means that they are differently deformed. Because if we're reading an archive that is actually aiming posterity, there is a huge deformation there that you have to work to deconstruct in order to do anything valuable with it. Just that challenges are different. Challenges are specific to each source all the time, right? This is not different. It's another thing which sometimes when I used to say, when I was speaking about literature, it seemed to offend people, was to say for a historian, all sources require the same challenge. And if I want to work as a historian with literature, I had to become a literary critic. I've been reading novels for decades because I need to know what these guys are doing in order to understand what I can do as a historian with this type of materials. Now, Machado in relation to other authors, to other 19th century authors. The first thing is there are things that that they share clearly, right? For example, this idea of verisimilitude is really interesting, especially in the case of José de Alencar, who was an incredible figure because he was an author in many different types of texts, right? He wrote speeches, he wrote political pamphlets, he wrote legal texts, he wrote plays, he wrote novels, he wrote chronicles. He tried his hand in almost all sorts of genres that were available in the 19th century. And he would speak about the same subject significantly differently, depending on what kind of narrative he was practicing. If you were speaking about slavery in the parliament, this would be even if you can find threads, common threads, there are things that could be said in fictional forms that could not be said in the parliament, and vice versa. Right? So an author is not an essence. In that sense, you really need to understand the narrative voice in each specific genre to see what is possible to say and how it is being said in each situation. But in the case of literature, Alencar himself has a very interesting passage in Senhora, in which he invents a dialogue in the novel about a novel that he had written. It's Senhora, and there are two characters, Aurelia, the protagonist, and a gentleman. They were speaking about a novel that had just appeared, and the novel was Diva by José de Alencar. So, the characters are discussing a novel that Alencar had. And this is interesting also because these novels were not signed by Alencar. All of them had fictional authors. They had pseudonyms. Diva, Senhora, and what's the third one? Lucila, right? They're all signed by pseudonyms of a female author, right? So in that case, technically, Diva was not authored by Alencar, but But the conversation is the following: the gentleman was saying that he didn't like the novel because the main character could never exist in reality, right? And then Aurelia responds, kind of teasing him, saying, and more ambiguously, and so on. And there's another, and Senhora was published in 2 volumes. First volume, and then 5 or 6 months later, the second volume was published. Between the first volume and the second volume, there was a letter published in Jornal do Comércio criticizing the novel. And the critique was the following. The novel is not good because the character, Aurelia, is not plausible. Why wasn't it plausible? It wasn't plausible because Aurelia was in love with a man that she despised. And no woman would ever be able to love a man that she despises. So it's completely, there is no verisimilitude. This is a bad novel. And then, Alencar had to, and then, I don't know if it's Alencar or whoever, another woman comes up defending the plausibility of Aurelia. Right? But the discussion was, the evaluation was, is that possible in real life? We know that it doesn't exist in real life. But the question is, could it exist? Right? The difference, and in that sense, I think Machado is in deep dialogue with this type of situation. By the way, this is also true about Flaubert. Madame Bovary and the whole discussion about Madame Bovary, and Flaubert was prosecuted about this and so on, had to do with Flaubert saying that his defense is Emma Bovary is plausible. And the prosecutor was arguing the story is immoral. And Flaubert was saying, well, I don't care if you think it's immoral or not. The fact is that it is plausible. This can happen. If a bourgeois society is that, you can't blame me, right? But his defense was all in the name of the plausibility of the other story he had written. So it's not a Brazilian thing. And of course, Machado read Flaubert a lot. And actually, I don't know what kind of edition he had of Madame Bovary, but Flaubert, after he was acquitted, he thought the trial was so important that during the editions of Madame Bovary while he was living, the volume contained the trial records. He published the novel and the trial records together with it, because he understood how the discussion was important for the history of and also because the novel was an incredible success because it was prosecuted. But Machado is, of course, although he's similar to all the others in this regard, he's very different because the way he stretches that tension between the fictional author, right, and the real author, I mean, himself, the way he creates these fictional authors that acquire a density and become the real author in many ways. And he does this in a way that he takes the invention of fictional third-person narrators as an alterity in relation to himself to extremes that nobody else does, in at least in 19th century Brazilian literature, and frankly, not in the French literature that I've read, nor in the English and North American literature that I've been reading in the past several years. I don't see anything similar to this and in the 19th century in terms of the radical alterity that he creates in these third-person narrators. But you really have to see how that is constructed in the text and in the details of the narrative. So he is just one more, and yet at the same time, he's very different. And I think that has to do with race. He knew that he had to invent authors that would have a white diction, right? And I think that was part of the exercise, right? To have narrators that have a white the diction of a white wealthy author. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sidney. I just got a great message from Miqueias here, which is a mixture of Portuguese from the South with English. A recepção está esperando. Please convida as pessoas. So there's a reception outside. We are all invited to go. I wanted to thank you all for coming, and thank you, Rafael, for your great comments, and thank you so much, Sidney, for being with us, and thank you, Peter, for being here. It's been great to see you. You're more and more, really, I've told you already, I mean, it's your father. I mean, and it's impressive. But anyway, thank you so much, Sidney. Please go to